Hi, my name is Maria, and this is my channel, Maria Might Read That, which is still kind of new to say. Today we are here to do a long overdue wrap-up. I have somehow become really behind on doing wrap-ups for the last, I think I have 2 months to cover here. I generally try to do recent reads rather than like a monthly wrap-up, and then somehow that became me just not prioritizing and not getting around to it. So we're playing catch up today, and I'm a little nervous. I've been putting this video off because I have 11 books to talk about, which might not seem like much, but I talk a lot. So this video may end up being split up into 2 parts. We shall see. Or if I can manage to get through them quickly and kind of touch on the basic thoughts, that would be great, considering the fact that this intro is probably longer than it needs to be. We shall see. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into the books and try to get through these as quickly as we can. The first book that I've got to talk about is The Cheat Sheet by Sarah Adams, which is actually kind of outside of my usual fantasy wheelhouse. This is a romance novel that I picked up on completely on a whim. Rye from Rye's Reading Corner featured it in a book haul, and the premise just sounded really good and had a lot of my favorite romance tropes, and I was just kind of in the mood, so I picked it up and it really worked for me. I really enjoyed it. This book has the like best friends to lovers trope as well as mutual pining. They've kind of been pining after each other for years. The male love interest is a football player, and he and his football friends put together this kind of cheat list, kind of like they have in sports, a cheat sheet that gives you like the different plays to kind of try and help him woo his best friend. Like I said, this has the best friends to lovers trope, mutual pining, sports romance. It's got fake dating. It was just really cute. I really like best friends to lovers as a trope in general. That always gets to me. This was really cute. You follow both POVs in this. I did enjoy his POV more than hers. She was a bit more repetitive, I felt like, in her mental thoughts, and also just took a really long time to be convinced that that they were both mutually pining for each other. It was past the point where I kind of thought it was a bit realistic, so I enjoyed his a lot more. He also just had like really great football team friends. They were definitely done in a way that wasn't very like, you know, super masculine. They had really great emotional conversations. They were willing to be there for each other and be vulnerable and be good friends, and they were some of like the best scenes were involving him and his football team. She's a dancer, specifically a ballerina, and I did ballet growing up, so there was that fun connection there. And just in general, I thought that this was really great. There isn't very much spice to it, I would say. I think it's a lot of, it's not even fade to black really, it's more like you barely get any content, which I don't mind, but just wanted to throw that out there for anyone who kind of goes into this. It is adult romance because they're both adult characters, but it's definitely not adult in terms of the smut scenes. So yeah, I just really enjoyed this, had a great time with it, and I saw on Goodreads that it doesn't have the best reviews, and most people seem to be upset about the mutual pining aspect of it, just kind of saying things like how stupid these two characters have to be to not realize that they like each other. So if mutual pining is not your thing, you might not enjoy this, but I really like the angst of that, so it worked for me. I read this in a day and I gave it 4 stars. Again, just really enjoyable, perfect palate cleanser between fantasies. Next up, I'm going to talk about 2 Robin Hobb books in order. So the first one is The Willful Princess and the Piebald Prince, and this is a novella. It's kind of a fairy tale-esque or legend of something that gets mentioned in the Farseer trilogy, and it's basically about this kind of downfall of this prince that has the wit magic, which in Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings world is the ability to communicate and kind of bond with animals. And so we get this mention in the Farseer trilogy about this kind of tragic tale of the Piebald Prince, and then this is the actual kind of legend or fairy tale that we get explaining everything that went down and giving us context for why the wit is so kind of despised and feared in society. It's recommended to read this between Farseer and Tawny Man, so you can get to it either right after Farseer or right after Live Ship, but you definitely want this context going into Tawny Man, which is why Kristen and I picked it up. I really enjoyed this. It was a novella, so I wouldn't say that I have like stellar thoughts on it or anything, but as far as Robin Hobb's writing goes, it's an unpopular opinion, but I personally feel like this is what I personally prefer her writing style in. She kind of has like a campfire-y, almost fairy tale-esque writing style in general to me, and so in a fairy tale setting, I feel like it works better for me. It just, rather than in full-length novels. Again, unpopular opinion, but I think that like in this context format, it just worked for me a bit better. It's a very tragic tale. It's almost like watching a train wreck happen and just like everything's doomed, but it was interesting to see that context. I gave this 3.5 stars. And then the next Robin Hobb book that I want to just talk about here, even though I did read it a month later, is Fool's Errand, which is book 1 of the Tawny Man trilogy. So Kristen and I are continuing our Robin Hobb buddy read. We are definitely kind of having different levels of enjoyment, I would say, with these books. I'm still just not loving Robin Hobb, unfortunately, whereas Kristen is much more into them, which is great. So we will see kind of how far the read along goes and whether or not Kristen just kind of ends up marathoning them and going on without me. We'll see, but I'm back to not being miserable reading them, if that makes sense. Assassin's Quest was a really tough read for me. I did not enjoy my time with this one, whereas with Fool's Errand, I actually did enjoy it overall. It just doesn't grip me. We've kind of talked about this before. Robin Hobb just unfortunately does not fully connect with me, but I really enjoyed the plot of this. It does kind of have almost like a mystery investigation sort of style for it within Robin Hobb's kind of court politics setting, which was fun. We are continuing to follow Fitz. I think that just in general, Fitz is he has a very specific kind of mental thought process. He's pretty melancholy. He goes through the same mental struggles over and over, and he has development with them, but also at the same time, he's still himself. And he's just he's not an unlikable character to follow, but he's a tough person to be in the head with. And I think where most people, they connect to him and really go through these emotions with him, I don't connect with him. And so after a while, I just kind of start to wish that we were following other POVs with it alongside him. It's just a lot of time to be in his head with him. And then the only other thing I really want to mention about this, since I've talked so much about Robin Hobb previously, is just that I hear a lot of people talk about how much they hate Molly from this Realm of the Elderlings and how she's the worst character, how she is just absolutely awful. Nobody talks about the fact that Starling is so much worse. So much worse. She's the worst character of Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings, and I'm including like the baddies. They're at least interesting. She's just awful. She's terrible. The thing that she says to that little boy at the beginning of Fool's Errand, I forget his name, I think it's Hap or Hop, is just atrocious. Starling is the worst. You cannot change my mind on this. That is all I have to say. Oh, and I gave Fool's Errand 3.5 stars, so again, just enjoying it, but middle of the road. Next, let's talk about The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons. This is book 1 in the Chorus of Dragons series. This is a very unique, kind of interesting series, both in the way that it's told and just the different kind of fantasy elements that it has. In the first book, you're following kind of almost 3 narrations. You have Kieran, who's the main character, and he's in prison, and he kind of is telling his story of how he got to in prison back to his jailer. But then his jailer kind of intercedes and goes, no, actually, that's not what happened. You started way later. You should have started way back here. This is when everything kind of started to lead you to where you're at. And so she then goes back and starts telling his story from that earlier perspective. So you're following kind of the same story, but in different linear points and going back and forth between those. And then you also have a narrator that is there because it's kind of set up as if this is an actual book in this fantasy world that was written and published. And so the narrator in his footnotes is kind of making different comments and corrections to different things that these two characters are saying and narrating for us. And it follows kind of this really complex, convoluted plot that you can't really explain, but essentially something about kind of a prophecy and whether or not Kieran is the chosen one. There's a lot of, like I said, complexity and uniqueness because we have characters that can switch bodies. We have a character that can kind of mimic or imitate the people that she's killed by taking on their memory and their kind of skin or their look. We have regeneration, and so there's characters that were previously, had a connection to other characters, but now they don't know each other, and it causes all of these interesting kind of situations. This is barely even kind of fully dived into in book 1, but it's a very complex story, and I'm sure from what I've heard, it only kind of gets more unique and interesting from there. I found the unique structure really cool, but I did feel like sometimes it was done for almost like the gimmickiness of it rather than for any point or like driving force of the plot. For example, we get to a point where one of the narrations is kind of not actively moving along the way that the other one is, and so it just wasn't always necessary. It's a book that you just kind of have to be along for the ride with. You have to assume that you won't necessarily understand everything and that this is gonna, there's gonna be complexity to it. I did feel like I almost expected it to be more confusing when I first started it. It didn't really start having those elements of like body switching and, reincarnations and things like that until we got to about the 300-page mark. So I was almost reading it and being like, oh, this isn't that hard to follow. And then it hits you and it's like, oh, actually it is a little bit hard to follow, but I think that that's part of the fun with it. You kind of just have to go with it. I am also now just realizing that I think I said regeneration earlier when I was talking about this. Reincarnation is what I meant. I've watched too much Doctor Who. I really liked all the different races, cultures. I really liked the narration and the footnotes and kind of the humor and comedy of those. The kind of like comedic asides, if you will. And one of the narrations, the jailer has this ability to, again, take on the memories and kind of skin of anyone she's killed. And so when she's telling Kieran's story, there's this great tension where you're trying to wonder if like, oh, did she murder this person and that's why she knows this information, or did she somehow get this information another way? So it's just this really great added tension on top of everything. My biggest hang up with this book is that I just didn't really connect to any of the characters. So as interesting as the plot was, I really, like, for me as a character-driven reader, I need to connect. So I'm hoping that will happen in later books. I am going to keep trying with the series and pick up the next book, and I gave this one 3 stars. Next up, let's talk about a book that I was majorly disappointed by, and that is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is a book that I pre-ordered, that I had just as in general like a very anticipated new release of this year, because it follows kind of the themes of justice and law, which are absolutely fascinating to me, and the author actually is a lawyer. So I thought that this would be perfectly kind of suited to my tastes, and unfortunately it just wasn't. We follow an emperor's justice who travels from town to town, hearing complaints, making judgments, and kind of serving as judge, jury, sort of executioner, depending on the situation. These justices also have different magical powers that I'm not going to talk about because of spoilers, but that are actually really cool. When you read the synopsis of this book, it sounds like we're going to be following directly the POV and kind of perspective of this justice himself, Sir Conrad von Volt, but it's actually his 19-year-old clerk that is telling the story. She's traveling along with him, she's kind of training under him, and she is telling her story, and also has that kind of look back narrative framing where she's also older and she's telling her story but commenting on it from an older perspective. Helena, who's the clerk, and von Volt start to also then investigate a murder and kind of start unearthing a wider conspiracy that will affect the whole empire. This is kind of lower fantasy, I would say. There's not that much fantasy elements to it. It's definitely a fantastical world, and there are those kind of justice powers that we talk about, but otherwise it reads almost as like a murder mystery investigation. I thought that maybe that plot wouldn't grip me that much, but I actually ended up wanting it to lean into that more. I feel like we don't actually get to see them investigate the murder to the level of like detail that I would have wanted. It then kind of takes a turn and follows other plot points that I can't talk about, obviously, but that I found a lot less interesting. I found Helena absolutely insufferable. Like, she was unfortunately the biggest gripe for me about this book. She just is she's very young. She reads very young, and I'm sure that maybe her older self comments back on this and kind of almost points it out sometimes. So probably there will be that character development, and we're gonna get to see her go from point A to point D and really change a lot. But being in her head at point A is just, I couldn't bear it. And I almost DNF'd this book. I really should have DNF'd this book. She whines so much. Someone will have died and she's over here like complaining about how she's hungry and she's cold. She goes through a lot of career crises in this, where she's like, I don't want to be a justice. I do want to be a justice. Oh, I don't want to be a justice. And she, by the end of the book, hasn't even made up her mind still. I think the career thing is also just like, it comes off as passive to me, where we don't really see her making a choice or taking a stance anywhere in the book. She's just kind of being pulled along and by kind of the spur of her emotions, or by the story, if that makes sense. She's supposed to be really talented. A lot of people in the story comment on how she's like really talented and really would make such a great justice, and we never really see that, in my opinion. We don't really see any of her skill come through. Because we're following her perspective, we end up following kind of a relationship that's developing with her, and it just was so insta-love, and there was just no connection there, and I did not want to spend time focusing on this relationship, and I feel like we spent way too much time focusing on it. She's supposed to have been a street orphan, but has no street skills or kind of survival skills. There's a lot of times when she has to be almost rescued or kind of assisted by other characters. And then there's an even weirder romance that starts developing at the end of the book that it could have maybe bought if we had somehow developed it more, but the way that it was done, I could see it becoming a bigger plot point in the continuation of the rest of the series, and I just was so not on board with that, and that's a big reason of why I won't be continuing. Helena's narration, and then I just do not want to see this relationship. Things outside of Helena, kind of, again, she was my main gripe. We didn't really get the exploration of justice and law that I wanted. We kind of almost got more about just corruption, and maybe that's to come in later books, but I wanted it to start in this one. I wanted more nuance on what's right, what's wrong, what kind of morality, things like that, and it felt like it just didn't give me that nuance that I was looking for. And we kind of get a bit of it with Von Volt, but I still wanted to explore it in more depth. I guess that's what I'd been kind of looking for going in. And then I had also heard that there was a courtroom scene, and that was one of the biggest reasons that I pushed through instead of DNFing. And I will tell you that if that is what you are waiting for, do not wait for that, because it's probably a couple pages and it's not even really a courtroom scene. It's like, it starts, we're about to have this case presented before the judge, and then we switch topics and the plot has to go in a different direction. So that was a disappointment, but it was toward the very end. So by that point I was like, well, I might as well just finish. Not to rant about this book for too much longer, but it gets very kind of dark at the end. Again, there's a lot of corruption, grimdark leaning tones. I think that's just also not my type of world and story that I want to explore. And then also I just felt like there were things that didn't quite make sense as far as like Conrad von Valt is supposed to be this justice that can really have a lot of immense power, but then in other positions he doesn't. He's supposed to be this justice that can decide these cases, but then his case is to be brought before the judge and he doesn't have the power to decide it. Like, there were a lot of situations where I was like, that doesn't quite line up. So I don't know, I just had a really bad time with this book, and just it was really disappointing considering how high hopes I had going into it and how much I did enjoy the beginning, like 200 pages. So I thought that this was, I thought that I was due for a good read, and then unfortunately it went south. I gave this one 2.5 stars. In contrast, a book that I absolutely loved, and that was probably my favorite read of these 2 months, is The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison, and this is a new favorite. It wasn't quite a 5 stars, I did give it 4.5, just because I feel like it was lacking a little bit of that special feeling of like a, favorite, but I had such a good time reading this, and it's a bit of a niche recommendation. It definitely isn't for everyone in terms of what it kind of does, but it just gave me so much joy reading it. This follows the youngest half-goblin, half-elf son of an emperor who has lived his life in exile because of his goblin blood, and then unfortunately there's a big accident at the very beginning of this book that causes the death of both his father, the emperor, and his older 3 brothers who were in line for the throne, and he is pretty much the only one left who can essentially be emperor of this kingdom. So he's brought to the court and he has to navigate this political landscape while also kind of being aware that someone assassinated his family and that he could be next. He's got no friends, no advisors, no schooling, because he was never actually treated as the heir and no one thought he would inherit. So it's this story about him kind of trying to come to terms with his new position, his new power, him having to navigate this place where people look down on him for his half-goblin blood, and where he doesn't know who he can trust. It's a story almost about him trying to just find friendships within this really scary environment that he's now in, and it's also just a very deeply political book. And when I say political, I don't mean political even in the way that other fantasies are political, but in the sense that it's literally about a new emperor trying to organize his government. This is kind of the boardroom almost politics. Like, you follow his everyday political tasks. You follow him writing letters, trying to make alliances, going to meetings, trying to negotiate what projects will be approved, which ones won't, do they have the funding. And it might not be for everyone if that's not something that interests you. It's definitely more of a narrow scope on this one court. It's not a kind of broader, more epic scope. It's a more intimate look, and it's again very kind of day-to-day maneuverings. But I love political storylines, and I loved the character-driven kind of day-to-day slice of life look at this court and at this Goblin Emperor Maya trying to kind of make friends and just try to be the type of ruler that he wants to be and decide that for himself. It was such a wonderful read. It's also a bit intimidating because there are so many names. You pretty much get the names of every single servant, staff, everyone in this palace or court, and because we're not kind of following them specifically or getting to know them gradually, Maya is also thrust into this and just kind of has to learn all the names, learn all the people. We get to experience that feeling of overwhelm with him, so that can be a bit intimidating, but once you get kind of a little bit used to it, I found that it got easier. There's also a very intimidating beginning to this book because it kind of introduces their like language almost and how the different phrases that they would use, but it does it in a very like almost textbooky way. I would almost recommend starting past that and with the actual storyline and then going back to it, or just not paying too much attention to it. You don't need to study it and actually know it in order to follow the story, but because you're kind of confronted with it first, it can be very intimidating. And I actually previously had picked this book up, read that, and just was so overwhelmed I put it down. So I would say push through that or just skip it and come back to it. It's more there to give you more of the world building than it is for you to actually have to know everything and be able to follow along with it. I just really loved this. I loved Maya, I loved the characters. I loved that this was a story kind of about imperfect people just doing their best. I'd say the biggest takeaway I have from this book is that you don't have to be a perfect person to do the right thing. It's proof that having a temper or unkind thoughts doesn't mean that that's who you have to be. So Maya has moments where, he might think and want to act in a certain way, but as long as he checks that and he then chooses and actively moves in the direction of doing the kind of right or just or kind thing, that's really all that matters. And I just loved that depiction that he's not just perfectly naturally doing the right thing. He has to actively choose to do that. And I think that's a really powerful lesson. If anything that I just talked about or gushed about with this sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend. Like I said, this is my standout book from the last 2 months. Let's briefly touch on two self-pub books that I read as well, and that is The Swordsman's Intent and The Swordsman's Lament. These are a prequel and then a first book in the series. These are both by G.M. White, and the series is The Royal Champion. These both were given to me as gifts by my lovely friends, so Cassidy gifted me with The Swordsman's Intent, and then my friend Mary Beth sent me The Swordsman's Lament for my birthday. Thank you both so much for gifting these to me. That was so lovely, and just I felt so loved. And I had a really good time with these. I would say that I read the prequel first and then the first book. I would recommend doing it reverse, so reading Lament first and then Intent, because even though technically this is a prequel, it spoils some of the kind of interesting stuff that you would get to be revealed in the first book, Lament. It's more interesting, I would say, probably to go back in and fill in your knowledge of the character than it is to have that knowledge going into the first book. This essentially follows kind of the King's Champion or dueler. In the prequel, Swordsman Intent, they are kind of choosing the next royal champion, who will be the next dueling champion to kind of represent the king and to take on any challenges that the king is issued with. And we're kind of following the essentially kind of like it's not quite an academy setting, but they're all learning how to duel and learning their kind of sword work and trying to compete for this position of the new royal champion. And then in Swordsman Lament, we are following the royal champion, and he is trying to investigate a murder. These are a lot of fun in terms of like bantery dialogue. I would say that the banter dialogue is a bit better in the first book, Lament. In the prequel, it did feel a bit more like play acting to me, so that was a complaint that I had about the prequel. It just felt a bit more forced, and like the characters were saying what they needed to in the dialogue for the sake of what you as the reader needed to find out rather than naturally. In Lament, in Lament, I did not have that same issue. I thought that the dialogue was a lot more natural and it had great banter, but I actually wish that it would have focused sometimes on less of the comedy and more of the emotional beats. I wanted a bit more of those explored. And then I also, because they're just smaller books, these didn't really give me the same level of kind of depth that I would have wanted with the characters in another book that's just larger. I wanted more page time. And also the first book, Swordsman's Lament, reads as a pretty much a standalone. You have a very fully wrapped up story, so I don't feel any urgency to pick up the next book in the series, which is why I won't be continuing on most likely. And I think that that's kind of the main reason why they just read as very fully wrapped up books and stories. I'm happy I read them. And I wish, again, that they had been longer, just explored more stuff or more emotional beats in order for me to really kind of have a lot of feelings and connection to them, but they were enjoyable reads overall. I gave the prequel, Swordsman's Intent, 3 stars, and the first book, Swordsman's Lament, 3.5 stars. The next two I'm just going to briefly talk about because they are part of a series that I have been talking about in every other wrap-up, and that is the continuation of the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, book 4, which is in the Labyrinth of Drakes, and book 5 within the Sanctuary of Wings. And these are both by Marie Brennan. I've been reading these as part of a read-along with 4 other booktubers, and we have had live discussions for each of these, so I will link the 4th and the 5th live discussions down below if you want to check them out for more thoughts. This is a fantasy series that is formatted in a way as if we are reading the memoirs of Isabella Trent, who has become renowned for her work as a dragon natural historian, and we follow her from childhood when she first develops this passion for dragons, and then throughout her career as she kind of makes different discoveries and becomes more famous within this world. It's almost kind of a Victorian setting, so she also has a lot of obstacles in her way as far as what women are allowed to do, and especially women in science, which is really unheard of at that time. And it's a very kind of, I would say, low fantasy. Pretty much it's our world, but with dragons existing, and the dragons here are more of a, like any animal that you would study. I've talked a lot about how I love Isabella as a character. I love her passion for dragons, and that I kind of feel like that I'm getting to live vicariously through her, because if I had the opportunity to go out and study dragons, that would be a dream job. Isabella is also just a very fun character to follow, in my opinion. She's a very kind of witty, kind of almost sassy, very passionate main character, and so I just really enjoy her narration as well. Every book kind of has a different setting, and this one's more of a desert setting. I really enjoyed that. And there's a great romantic subplot in this one that I just thought was very almost like Jane Austen-esque. Don't go into the series for the romance, because that's definitely not, it's not what you're gonna get. It's not a big part of the series, but what we got in this was really enjoyable. I almost wanted more kind of swoon-worthy or pining moments, more declarations of love, if you will. It doesn't really make sense for the characters, but like, I wanted it. And I would say that this one, I feel like we again went from book 3, which had a lot of dragons. This one had less dragons, and it was more of a sad setting for the dragons, so that wasn't my favorite, but I still really enjoyed this and gave it 4 stars. And now we're going to talk about the 5th and final book of this series, so Within the Sanctuary of Wings. When I tell you, that this is my biggest disappointment of the year so far. I mean, this is top Justice of Kings, and I just fully ranted about that for probably several minutes. This book did not deliver on what I wanted it to give me. It's not a bad book, objectively speaking, and I've seen people who have loved the series love this conclusion as well. It just wasn't what I wanted from it. I've mentioned before that I previously read books 1 through 4 in December of last year. I binged through them, I loved them. Then I found out about this read-along, and so I paused, I reread books 1 through 4 along with the group, and then I got to this one. So I feel like because I've been waiting for this finale for an extra long time, that might have kind of compounded how disappointed I am in this. My biggest issue with this is that it changes the tone of the entire series prior to it. So it goes in a very different direction than what we were kind of set up to believe. If this had been the first book and that's what we were given as the premise, I could have gotten on board with it. It's still not, the kind of reveal that we get in this is still not to my taste, but because it was done at the end as kind of what we had all been leading up to, that's what especially bothered me about it. And I feel like it kind of also somewhat changes, not like the genre, but it feels like it makes it way more fantasy than I was expecting before. And I'd liked the level of fantasy we had before that, so I wasn't a fan of that in general. And it also, it kind of, the big reveal in this book is the thing that Isabella Trent is known for, what really makes her career. And we were talking live about how frustrated we all were that it wasn't really in her field. Like, the thing that she becomes known for is kind of not her own discovery. It's essentially her stumbling on something, and then essentially through her part that she plays in that, that's what makes her famous, rather than her doing the scientific work to become known in her field. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to be very vague because of course it's a series conclusion, but it just felt like there were other things that we had been leading to, other plot threads of like discoveries she could have made that I would have been much happier with, but because the author leaned more into kind of this big shock twist ending almost, which she's done in the other books as well. She tends to want to go for like a big ending. That's where I feel like it just didn't provide that satisfaction. And I also think that with each book in the series, we went more away from kind of the dragon natural historian premise and more into leaning into like cultural explorations, which you can clearly tell is Marie Brennan's kind of passion. She's an anthropologist, and so that really bleeds into the work, but it's what I was less interested in, and I feel like we got just a higher percentage of it as we went on, and I would have preferred otherwise. I gave this 2.5 stars, but based on how I feel about it, I might even bump it down to a 2, which is just, again, really disappointing considering the fact that the series has been like 4.5, 4 stars for me all along, and it's become one of my favorites as far as just how unique and kind of the premise that it follows and how much fun I had following along with it. Thankfully, because the books are so cemented in my mind as individual books, this doesn't ruin the other 4 for me, and I will kind of be thinking of it as like the series ends with book 4, but it just was sad not to get like the conclusion that I was hoping for. I don't think other people were as disappointed with this ending as I was. I've seen a few people really love it and then others that were kind of more mediocre on it. I think for me the reveal that we got in this just really didn't work. And the last book that I have to talk about is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah, which was also a new release that I had been really looking forward to, and one that thankfully did kind of meet my expectations. It wasn't a new favorite, but I did really love it and had a great time reading it. This is an Own Voices Arab adult fantasy inspired by the tales of 1001 Nights. We follow Luli, who is also known as the Midnight Merchant and is a legendary smuggler known for being able to find and sell magical artifacts. With Luli, we also have her secret jinn bodyguard, Kadir. He has to hide who he is because in the society and world, jinn are hunted, and when Luli kind of becomes embroiled with the lives of the royals, she saves one of their lives. She comes to the attention of the Sultan, who then blackmails her into going out and finding a kind of magical, powerful relic for him. I will say that although this is an adult fantasy, it reads more as like crossover, almost YA leaning, in my opinion, and I think that that's just something you should know going in. I did expect it to almost dig a little bit deeper and go more adult, and it didn't quite give me that. It is also kind of more plot driven in my opinion. I wanted more time with the characters and we didn't quite get that, but what I absolutely loved about it are the desert setting. It's such a kind of vivid magical setting. We have all of the jinn mythology and just really cool magical relics and their powers, and 1001 Nights. The author has described it as like a love letter to oral storytelling, and you definitely see that in here. The tales of 1001 Nights are embedded and done in just a very kind of storytelling way within this larger story, and that's something that I've always loved finding in books. I love kind of embedded storytelling. It's also a fun contrast to other adult fantasies that just go very dark This one is a lot more fun for about 2/3 of it. It does go darker toward the end, but it feels just like a very fun adventure. It's got a quest element to it almost, where they're traveling. It's also got a travel story. They're traveling to find the relic and kind of coming upon different obstacles along the way. And we have fun character archetypes like a cowardly prince, a djinn bodyguard, with his own mysterious secrets. We have Luli, who's the midnight merchant. They're also joined on their travels by this djinn hunter or warrior, and obviously because Kadir is a djinn in hiding, there's a lot of tension within that. So a lot of fun to this story. I really enjoyed my time with it. I'm excited to see where the story and the series goes on from here. I'm hoping that we do dig a bit deeper into certain things. When I say it was YA leaning, I feel like it almost had the emotional struggles that the characters were going through felt more YA, and it felt like more repetitive rather than really exploring the nuances as much as I wanted. So that's what I mean there. But I would highly recommend this book to anyone who's looking for just a really fun time, very not atmospheric in the sense of like description heavy book, but just a very desert setting. Like, it's such a vivid setting, even though the descriptions are very light and just kind of as we go. It's just a very, you can picture it, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. And I also loved the exploration of kind of what courage means, and with that cowardly prince, kind of what different forms courage can take. So that was really lovely. Just a really great kind of adventure of a book. I gave this 4 stars and would definitely recommend. So those are the books that I wanted to talk about. I hope that I was able to squeeze it all into one video. If not, then you will be seeing a part 1 or a part 2. We'll have to see what editing Maria decides to do based on how long this turns out to be. And at least this now brings me up to date on July reads, and we can hopefully do wrap-ups or recent reads much more often and with fewer books, so that it doesn't feel like this overwhelming playing catch-up. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books, what you've been reading in the meantime, or if you want to try any of these books out. I'd love to chat with you down below. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I hope you have a great day.